Welcome to the Legal Ledger. I'm Sara Clark, and I'm joined today with Jennifer Hardin. And as you know, we run a legal hotline at OSBA in the legal division, and one of the questions that we frequently get on that hotline is a question about what the law says about a specific topic. And the answer to that question is not always as easy as it seems, is it, Jenny?
No, it isn't, Sarah, and it's partly because of those quotation marks around the phrase "the law." The law can mean statutes and ordinances, and it can also mean the legal authority that governs an issue. It means the answer to a particular question actually requires a review of several sets of laws, and those can include both federal and state laws, rules, and regulations, as well as interpretations that are issued by the executive branch and the judicial branch.
And in some cases, those sources of law can conflict with each other, right? And so at the risk of maybe turning into a Schoolhouse Rock episode, we're going to spend a little time talking today about some of those different sources and how they interact with each other. So Jenny, which one do you want to start with?
Let's start with legislation. I mean, I think that's what people basically mean when they use the phrase "the law." They're starting with the actual laws. That when they say, "Tell me what the law says," they mean, is there a statute that governs this?
Right. And you mentioned, I think at the beginning, there are federal laws, there are state laws, and sometimes even within the federal and the state level, there's conflict. And so we'll get questions sometimes about, well, what supersedes each other's, which law prevails. And so for that answer, we turn to something called the Supremacy Clause, which generally states that when federal law and state law conflict with each other, that federal law prevails.
Yeah, and of course you use that word generally, so as lawyers do, because there are lots of exceptions.
Right.
There are times when the federal law exceeds constitutional authority, or it's silent, or it allows for concurrent state regulation, or where state law provides more coverage or more protections to the individual. And in those cases, we rely on state law.
Right. So legislative branch makes the laws, and the executive branch, which is the next source of legal authority that we're going to talk about, is the group that's responsible for carrying out the legislative laws and the statutes. And so the law in this branch typically includes things like executive orders, agency rules, agency regulations. And so while most of the orders that we talk about in the legal division, most of the orders and the rules that are relevant to school districts come from the U.S. Department of Education and the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce, there are a number of state and federal agencies that issue rules and regulations that impact schools.
Yeah, and some recent example of those types of laws include the new federal Title IX regulations issued by the U.S. Department of Education, or the new state school transportation rules proposed by the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce, ODEW. Executive orders and regulations have the force of law as well in some cases, right, Sarah?
That's right. And I think because of that, what we're seeing more often, I think, or maybe not more often, but at least more publicly, are lawsuits that are filed when somebody thinks that an agency's rules or orders conflict with or maybe unlawfully expand upon what's written in the statute that it ties back to. So we have a lot of examples of this, including some of the rules that you just mentioned. Mm-hmm. For example, within the Title IX rules, I think we have at least 5 different lawsuits, maybe even more now, that have argued that the U.S. Department of Education has actually incorrectly interpreted or maybe expanded unlawfully the scope of what the Title IX statute actually provides for when they released those rules.
Yeah, that's right. And that actually leads us to our last source of the law, which is the judicial branch. It's responsible for interpreting laws and rules. This branch is made up of the court system, both at the state and the federal level, which decides how laws should be applied in specific cases and issues rulings on those.
And as you mentioned, it's made up of a lot of different systems, both at the federal level and at the state level. And a court decision in one jurisdiction maybe not necessarily applicable or binding in another jurisdiction, right?
Yeah, it depends on where the case took place. Depending on where the case took place, it may or may not be applicable to school districts in Ohio. For example, a decision in a state court in California could be persuasive to a judge in Ohio if he or she was provided that precedent, but the Ohio judge wouldn't be required to consider that case or follow it.
And I think that's helpful to know and helpful to remember as you come across decisions across the country. So what happens when there's conflict between all of these different branches and all of these different sources of the law? And we say this a lot, but I think it emphasizes the importance of reaching out to your board counsel when issues like this come up. So if you have a state statute, a federal rule, a case from the U.S. Supreme Court, and a guidance document from the U.S. Department of Education that are all saying different things potentially, that can create obvious issues for your district. And so it may be, candidly, that it's not possible to comply with all of these laws because there's a conflict within the law, or the law is not settled on the topic that you have a question about. So your counsel can walk through the relevant weight potentially of each of the sources of law when there's a conflict, and the risks of complying or not complying with each source of law.
That's such an important thing for districts to remember. I mean, I think everybody wants a clear, clean, easy answer, but they just don't exist in some situations.
That's right.
You have to look at all of those different things, and it's frustrating not to have a single resource that they can rely on. But that's why your legal counsel's there.
That's exactly right. And use those legal resources to help you in this area. Call your board counsel, reach out to us in the legal division. We're here to help, happy to help.
Yeah, and on that note, let's wrap up this episode of the Legal Ledger Sidebar. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much.